Welcome to the Everyday Ministry Podcast. We're a podcast where everyday ministers get together to discuss ministry. This is James White, the pastor at Lighthouse Community Church. And
I'm Chris Norsworthy. I'm one of the associate pastors at Reformation Church in Louisiana.
How's everything going?
Everything's going good, man. Just living the dream.
Well, is it a good or bad dream? That's all I need to know.
It's a good dream. Nothing really new has happened since the last time we recorded. So, just doing everyday ministry kind of stuff every day.
I understand. Well, I mean, obviously you're not going to talk about every small thing in your life, but I'm curious. This whole 36-day letter thing you got going on, tell us a little bit about that.
There's an Instagram account called 36 Days of Type or something like that. So some of my friends were doing it, and I was like, I'll jump on the bandwagon. So basically just a bunch of artists on Instagram. So it's for 36 days. They're creating a unique letter of the alphabet every day. So one day everybody does A, one day everybody does B, and you just kind of share it. That's it. And then there's the 10 numbers 0 through 9. So that's why it's 36. Okay. So I just did it. I thought it'd be fun, and rather than watching everybody do it for a month and me not join in, I decided to do it, and it'd be a little fun exercise to push myself to do something artistic every day. Not like I don't have other stuff to do, because it's my job to do artistic stuff every day. But it's just something fun.
Well, by the time this episode releases, you're going to be around letter J or K, so I'm curious to see the next 10 or 12 days of that.
Me too.
My favorite one so far is A, which was Andy off of Toy Story.
Mine too.
Yeah.
I was really surprised that was yours, but I'm not going to say why I'm surprised.
Because I'm old.
Yes, that's why.
It came out in like 1994, right? I think it was 94. So it was like just late enough or early enough. I was 9.
Okay, so yeah, that came out right there with your time.
So if it had come out maybe like a year or two later, it would have been out of my wheelhouse, right? But it came out when I was 9, and it was the first full length featured computer animated film. So even back then, I guess I was paying attention to stuff like that. But then also the character, I really related to the character of Andy, but also Sid, because toys aren't real. So destroying
them.
So playing actively with toys the way Sid does may be destructive, and maybe he had some problems. But like in the movie, of course he's evil, but he doesn't know the toys are real. He's just playing with them creatively, and I played with my toys creatively as well. I was creative. I create things, and sometimes you have to break an egg to make an omelet. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, so did you or did you not cry during the third one?
Oh yeah, I teared up.
You teared up?
Once I teared up, it almost got me twice. Once I teared up whenever they were in the incinerator.
Yeah.
And then secondly, like whenever he tells them goodbye, like that was tough.
So are you going to have your cowboy hat on when you go and watch the football theaters?
I was always more of a Buzz Lightyear kind of guy, so no.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I have glass dome on.
Yes, so I'll have my wings.
But anyway, everything's going good on my end. Just like Chris, nothing's really changed in life. Just still not getting much sleep. And that's just the nature of having a newborn, I guess. But if you haven't noticed already, we don't have Jamie or Daniel on the podcast tonight. But there is a third voice that you're hearing. And I'm going to let Chris introduce him. But I do have to say, first and foremost, that he is another man with a red beard on the podcast tonight. So I'm excited about that. So Chris, go ahead and introduce our guest.
I'm outnumbered. Well, speaking of crying, it's hard to introduce Royce because he's one of my longest and best friends. So, I thought it'd be nice to have him come on. We went to Christ for the Nations Bible College together all the way back. We started in 2006 in Dallas, Texas, and we were both transplants there. And we were both single. We met, like, we were both getting married like the summer after our first year of Bible school. So we were both single guys, and then
Good times.
And then we got married, and then like we just like hung out every day for the rest of our lives until we both moved away. Yeah, Royce, Alanis, do you have anything to say for yourself? To introduce yourself?
Am I in trouble?
What do you have to say for yourself, young man?
No, I appreciate you guys letting me join in and have a good chat about some things that I'm passionate about and spent some time looking at. But anything I get to do with Chris, I'm going to jump right on it. So that's what it's all about.
Did I talk last time about how I'd just been to Memphis?
I can't remember if it stayed in the recording or not, but I asked you about the specific artwork you did.
Yeah, so I did the artwork with the Super Soaker, the August gun. That was Royce's band.
Okay.
So since he normally lives 15 hours away from me, whenever he was going to be in a city that was 5 hours away from me, I went to see him.
Yeah.
I understand that. So Royce, just for the listeners out there, tell us a little about yourself, where you live, what do you do, all of that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm currently residing in Des Moines, Iowa. So I'm a northerner.
Yankee.
Sorry guys. So I'm outnumbered in that way, but lived here I grew up here, but after Christ for the Nations, we moved back here 2010. So I've lived here for 9 years and loving it. I pretty early on after we moved back, we got connected with a good local church, Walnut Creek Church, and we've been real committed and got a wife named Jolie Alanis. She's wonderful and gorgeous and good helpmate, and just had our fourth child born into the world in September last year. So she's 6 months and she's a lot of fun. She's super cute and she breaks my heart every day. And so just, we're doing that. We moved around the same time that our fourth baby came. We moved to a little bit closer to downtown, kind of into a more urban neighborhood for us. I don't know if urban is even a word you use in Des Moines. It has like 200,000 people in it, but I guess everything's urban here. But yeah, so it's been great. It's been a fun journey. Got good connections here.
Well, could you talk a little bit, just for the sake of the listener, maybe a little bit about, given the topic at hand, some of your experience with evangelism and that kind of thing, and maybe like your future plans there. I mean, you don't have to go into super detail about it, but
sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. So, I mean, just joining, we didn't really know exactly what we were going to do when we moved here. We came out of Christ for the Nations kind of thinking we would pursue music, and actually we kind of had plans to move to Nashville. And kind of last minute, just kind of felt God leading us back up north. So when we moved here, we weren't sure exactly what was going to happen, but the nice thing is that we got connected with Walnut Creek Church pretty early on, and just built really solid relationships with people pretty quick. And Walnut Creek is they place a really good emphasis on evangelism and just getting out into the community, sharing your faith. That was a really good, I would say for sure the first couple years were a really good time of growth for us when it comes to kind of getting out of your comfort zone and being intentional with the community, with people in your sphere of influence, and even going out into public places and just kind of being bold and being willing to just basically talk to people and just start conversations. And so it's just that was a really good experience pretty early on. And I would say after probably maybe 3 or 4 years is when I had an opportunity to step into more of a leadership role at church. So I took on community group leader type role. Yeah, I would say maybe 2013 or 14. I'm really bad with dates and years, but yeah. And so that's been a really awesome experience, and I think that really helped me to grow even closer to the group and to really live more intentionally. And that's around the time I think I really started getting deeper into looking at how to best share my faith, and how to, I don't know. There's a lot of, I think the first couple years, you just realize all the things that can come up in evangelism and all the questions that people can ask. And so I think I started getting into apologetics probably around that time. And so since then, I've pretty much kind of been sticking with the church and doing what we're doing. And then I would say probably over the course of the last maybe 2 years, I started getting more into homeless ministry, which is a bit different from your regular, kind of cold turkey evangelism. And that's one of the things that prompted us to move into a more urban kind of inner city neighborhood. I would consider it probably an urban poor neighborhood, closer to downtown. A lot of my homeless ministry was downtown, especially in 2017, 2018. And so, kind of where we're at right now, we're finally kind of settled into our home, and still real dedicated to our community group and looking at how we can just have a presence in our neighborhood and kind of amongst people who it's a really diverse area. So there's, economically and ethnically, everything's a lot different than where we were before. So that's been a really good opportunity, I think, to take a look at our lifestyle and kind of take a look at how we relate to people. And so it's kind of where we're at right now. It's been a good journey.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's awesome. And one of the things that I think is inspiring to me is that a lot of the self-initiated things that you've done, where you took kind of the heart of your church that you're at, and reaching people, and you put it into use in your own unique way. Thought about you and this topic would go really well together. And since, the podcast is about everyday ministry, it's not just about pastors being pastors or anything like that. It's about every believer being a minister. So the topic that we're talking about tonight, like I said, is apologetics. So I guess we can dive into the topic if y'all are ready.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think first of all, we just need to answer the question, what is apologetics? I think most people probably know, but how would y'all define apologetics?
Well, I can go first.
Sure.
Because when you say y'all,
that means you. Y'all two.
You mean all three of us, right?
Y'all two. Why don't y'all two take a crack at it?
Okay. Well, I would say apologetics is a branch of Christian theology. It seeks to provide a rational justification for Christian truth claims on a reasoned, biblical, and evidential basis. And kind of in my experience with it, there's kind of, I would say, two main categories of apologetics. There would be positive apologetics, which that would be the bringing forth of positive arguments and evidence for God's existence and for the truth of Christianity. And again, that can be through reason, through scripture, just through evidence. And there's also negative apologetics, which would seek to provide rebuttals or responses to objections that might be raised against the existence of God or the truth of Christianity in general.
Yeah, I think it's a great explanation of it. I think we're going to look at the question of it being biblical in just a moment. The way you explained it as well, I think that it is this idea of giving a defense of our faith, whatever that defense may be or whatever our approach may be. I'm interested to hear you define the approaches those two different ways. Never heard of it in those two ways. Apologetics isn't something that I've dove deep into, but in my understanding, so often we see two different sides of this, and generally called the classical apologetics and the evidential apologetics. But then you also have a few more, the exponential apologetics, which from what I can gather of that approach, it's almost like testimonial, of what you've experienced in life, and that being kind of your defense of your faith.
Right.
Historical apologetics and the presumptual apologetics. So I'm curious to see, as we flesh out those two that you mentioned and kind of looking at those in more detail.
Yeah, classical apologetics, evidential apologetics, presuppositional apologetics, I would say, would be kind of the three more common types that you'll see today being used. So I don't know, if you want, I can kind of define those, and then we can kind of jump into the next section. Or
yeah, I mean, those are the kind of the three that I was actually going to plug. One of our plugs of the week, one was going to be my church.
Nice.
because we're actually teaching a class on it right now. Maybe it'd be good for James to watch.
That's right.
And those were while there are like a bunch of methods or sub methods or whatever, the three that I kind of talked about whenever I did approach it were classical, evidential, and presuppositional. And I mean, you might be able to define those more concisely than I can, Royce.
Yeah, classical would be the branch that relies pretty heavily on the view that man can, through reason, I would say, and with the help of God's Spirit, see the necessity and the evidence for God's existence. So that would be through things like philosophical reflection, or, of course, logical argumentation would probably be the more common way that people might have experienced it. And then evidential apologetics is fairly similar to classical in some ways. It's a branch that attempts to give persuasive evidences for belief in the Christian faith. So on historical grounds, or archaeological, even experiential, or even prophetic evidence, things of that nature. And then there's presuppositional apologetics that contends that all people have a knowledge of God's existence, but because of our sinful desires, this knowledge is suppressed. So any objections that maybe an unbeliever might give are generally more of a mask of their suppressed knowledge of God. And that's a lot of kind of what I've seen of that is based out of Romans 1. Has that been your experience, Chris?
Yeah.
So you're talking about like Romans 1:18 says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And then verse 20 talks about how the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. So that's where kind of like we all have that knowledge, but because of sin, it's been suppressed.
Yeah, and you're going to have a lot of crossover between those three. It's not like a presuppositionalist doesn't use logic or, evidence or, things like that. And I mean, just to name a few people who, like, if you've heard of any of these people, then you might say like, oh, okay, this is where they are. Like Dr. James White or Greg Bonson or Apologia Studios, Jeff Durbin. Those are presuppositional kind of guys. Evidentialists, I mean, you're going to have a lot of those. William Lane Craig, I mean, he would, right?
he kind of fluctuates between evidential and classical.
Yeah. And those two are very similar in a lot of ways, more than presuppositional. I mean, Case for Christ, Lee Strobel, what's the other guy's name that he wrote the book of Ready Defense and had Campus Crusade and all that kind of stuff. I forget his name. Most of apologetics evangelicals would be familiar with, or is probably going to be evidential. Answers in Genesis, those kind of things.
So would you say that because after you name, most of the people that fall into one form or the other, would you say that one's theology would dictate generally which apologetics they fall under?
It can. I mean, because Sproul, like R.C. Sproul, who's a Calvinist, he has a whole series on apologetics, and he's classical apologetics. So anybody from Ligonier is probably classical apologetics. But there's, I think, some of the people evidential camp are probably Calvinists, and some of the people, definitely, probably the majority of the people in presuppositionalists are Calvinists. So that, I mean, I would think so. I mean, not that I'm not just naming Calvinists, just because I know that there's Calvinists in all three versions of that we named. But I think that presuppositionalism is 99.9% Calvinists. And then,
Mhm.
but like I said, I think 99% of evangelicals will probably fall into maybe I'm wrong, fall into the evidentialist camp. That's the
Yeah.
most typical way.
Yeah, and Jeff Durbin is a good example of someone who's pretty clearly presuppositional, but in his street evangelism, he'll definitely resort to like logical argumentation.
Mhm.
But I've seen him do formal debates where he just presuppositional and cuts right to the chase.
Yeah, and I dislike his formal debates a lot less than the street stuff that he does. But
yeah.
that might be a personal issue rather than a theological issue.
We kind of see the definition of this, and then we've looked at the different methods of apologetics. But the question I think that we still need to answer, and it's probably the most important question of all of them, is it biblical?
Yeah, the key kind of apologetic Bible verse comes from 1 Peter 3, and I'll read from the ESV. It says, "Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone." And that Greek word defense is apologia, so that's where we get apologetics. So always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. I read, I think, 14 through 16 or something. But yeah, 1 Peter 3:15 is kind of the key apologetic verse.
Mm-hmm. Sure is.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I think we have that verse, and then we have plenty of other examples of the apostles in the Bible stating their case, both whenever they're being accused, but also both whenever they're going into, take an example of like the Mars Hill, where Paul's going in and then proclaiming the gospel, but he's relying on scripture, he's giving a biblical message, but he's also he's quoting their poets, he's using the things that they know to break through and help them understand what he's actually saying to them. So that's kind of, would you call that a positive?
Yeah.
Royce?
Yeah. Positive. You could even call it evidential, or I would say classical too, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
When I naturally thought of Paul because, we see other accounts where the apostles address it as well, even like Stephen in his death, right? He's laying out the foundation of his faith, but he's talking to a bunch of Jews essentially, so people with the same background as him, where Paul is addressing somebody from multiple different areas of life. And so and that's what we're going to tend to do in apologetics, right? Is address people that believe differently than us in a majority of ways. Yeah,
and meeting them where they're at, I think, is the main thing. I mean, you have Paul reasoning with people where they're at, with the knowledge they have, like said. I mean, even the Jews, when he reasons from the scriptures, I mean, he's basically something that they would have been well versed in, that they would have understood, that he would have had that opportunity to help use the scriptures to help them understand Christ in a way that they didn't before.
Yeah.
So, and then, I mean, of course, even the Gospels themselves are ruled with Jesus, use evidence and signs. So even those are real time, obviously it's not something that necessarily would have been, examined or falsified or anything like that. But in the moment, using evidence and signs, showing that he had the authority to do what he said he would do is definitely a type of apologetic.
Yeah, and even the Gospels themselves, how they're written, we typically look, so like, oh, Matthew was written to a Jewish people, and like that, those kind of things. They were written with certain people in mind to show them to show them scripturally, to show them according to the truth, according to the things that actually happen, but to show them specifically to those specific people what the gospel was and how they could relate to it. And that's what, I mean, we could get into the discussion, I think, of our next point that we wanted to talk about, if y'all are cool with that.
Sure.
What role, if any, did it play in your life?
Cool.
And then we can talk about more defined uses and purposes.
Yeah, I wasn't raised in an actively Christian home, so discussion about the important life topics like God were essentially non-existent in my home and my family. So for me, it wasn't until high school that I really on my own started thinking about some big existential questions related to purpose and meaning. meaning and begin to dwell on the idea of death and non-existence, or like, what it's like to experience non-being and how would that even work. And so the idea of these things just really staggered me quite often. At that age, you just don't know really how to articulate those types of questions to people, especially like your parents, if that's never even been something that they've ever expressed interest in talking to you about. So this was also, though, kind of around the time that I came across a Christian youth group. It was in the small town of Winterset, Iowa, where I was going to high school, and they were called the Power Company. So I was like, yeah, I'm definitely going there.
Sorry. Why were they called the Power Company?
Power, man. They were non-denominational, spirit-filled.
Yeah.
And the font was like lightning font. It was
That's
great.
Awesome.
So I started kind of attending there regularly with some friends, and all the while I was still pondering those kind of deep questions. And at some point, the youth pastor, he started talking about things like purpose and meaning and addressing the matters of death and eternity. And so I just reached a point where I realized that those questions that I had couldn't adequately be reconciled with a purely naturalistic like worldview.
Yeah.
But I did discover that they were answered pretty sufficiently in theism and specifically in the person of Christ. So it was around that time that I placed my hope and my faith in him. But of course, it wasn't until a lot later in my life that I even realized it would have been a form of apologetics that the role, the philosophical reflection side of apologetics played a pretty vital role in my conversion to Christianity. And then, of course, awesome. my interest in apologetics as an area of study didn't take place until, of course, 6 or 7 years ago. So yeah, so it's interesting to look back and wow, that was what was going on. Not really realize.
Yeah, without realizing what it was.
Right.
That's cool. It's really awesome because I grew up in a church. My dad's a pastor. So my whole life was all, my parents, the Bible and what God would want was part of every decision we made, basically.
Right.
So for me, it didn't really play a role in my life until, I guess, technically, it's hard to remember the whole timeline because we went to Bible school and then I started working at the ministry that was there. So I think it was after we graduated, I guess kind of, you brought it up. The church that you went to was non-denominational, I guess. And then the school that we went to was charismatic, non-denominational, which I would not self-identify as a charismatic anymore. So it was problematic for me to grow up in one church my whole life, my dad was my pastor, so there was no differentiation there. So to grow up knowing one brand of charismaticism my whole life, basically. And then to go to a school and they were bringing in speakers every week and there was all kinds of stuff going on. And, it just got to a point for me where it was just so confusing, or so maybe demoralizing, or I saw so much confusion and the lack of a standard for what truth was. So I got to that point towards the end of, graduating and that kind of thing. My first really coming across apologetics and knowing what it was actually in a class in school, but it wasn't called apologetics. It was like a missions class. But I started, after we graduated, I basically kind of took a step back and was just like, I don't know what I believe anymore. And I don't even know if I believe Christianity anymore. But it was really just the fact that everything I believed was Christianity. You know what I mean? So I kind of had to step back in apologetics, and we'll kind of talk about the tasks of apologetics here in a second. I fall under a different category or a different task because I do believe I was a Christian. I was a Christian. I needed my faith to be reassured. So I went and I listened and I read deists who came against Christianity and atheists, like the New Atheism movement, and read and listened to them. What did they have to say? And then listened to people like Tim Keller, Christians who were fighting for the faith, and eventually I landed back on, or I landed safely on the foundation of the Word of God and the Christian faith as being the truth. Apologetics helped, strengthen my faith and reassure me that the true parts of Christianity are true. The Bible is true, and that can be our foundation for all knowledge and for all truth. So that's I mean, it played a major role in my life in that way as a believer. And James, what about you?
Well, so for me, I was much like yourself, grew up in church to some extent. Mainly my grandparents, my parents did as well, but not as, not as often as they probably would have liked looking back on it. And so Christianity has always been something in my life. So like for me, I didn't have this moment where I really questioned what I believed as a whole. I knew I believed in Christ and God. I knew this is where I landed. And I don't know if this would fall under apologetics. Probably not, mainly because it's more in the inner circles of Christianity. But what I had to determine for myself last 2 years of high school and then on after that was really what I believed about God and what his word said about who he is, rather than just sitting under the preaching and believing whatever the pastor might have to say. And so I never had this moment where I had to work through if I believed in something different than Christ, but I did have a moment where I had to kind of solidify what I did believe in Christ and his word and his truths.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I guess we can go ahead and I know I have a quote from R.C. Sproul, or, basically he divides the tasks of apologetics 3 different ways. And I guess I'll just kind of paraphrase them. But first he says that apologetics provides an answer to the critics of the faith. So it answers critics. He says, secondly, that I guess this is more of an offensive type way, but it's a way of using apologetics to attack unbiblical things that, or structures, whether societal structures or faith structures or whatever. Thirdly, he says the task is that it's an encouragement to the saints, that it's a way to encourage believers. And Royce, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, for the uses.
Yeah,
I agree. I think it's definitely encouragement for the believer. I think we would probably all have the testimony of how some form of apologetic has served to affirm our beliefs, or even just help us to restructure our beliefs in a way that provides a more solid foundation for us. And I would say that is kind of what you experienced, James. I would say that's a form of apologetic, to look at your hermeneutic and build a defense for why your doctrines are what they are. I would say that's very relevant to apologetics.
Because there's, not saying that you were to this extent, James, but there's a lot of people who say that they're Christians, but you look at what they actually believe, and this could go to, Mormonism or something that far. Not saying, of course, you weren't that far, but anything in between, they would say they're Christians or whatever to some degree, or Roman Catholics who would say that they're Christian, like in the Christian faith. Well, or even, Baptists or Pentecostals or whoever, down to the individual. So that's what I meant. From the individual up to the, a big structure like the Mormons. You have to make a defense for the faith, but you also have to make, if it's someone else, you have to make an offensive argument for the faith. But if it's for yourself, then you have to teach yourself, and speak the word to yourself, and reason with your, use the reason God has given you in the Spirit to lead you to understanding the truth. That's, of course, there's many of like you said, hermeneutics and those kind of things that go into it. So it's going to be multidisciplinary if you wanted to subdivide it like that. But I definitely think apologetics, I would consider that apologetics.
Under the umbrella of encouragement for the saints, would be things like safeguarding yourself against spiritual, lapse, or, backsliding, especially in those seasons of spiritual dryness or, desolation, where you just don't sense God's kind of spirit or his presence, and his word maybe at times doesn't provide as much consolation maybe as it had before. Like those are great times where you can lean on your apologetic and kind of fall back on that to help safeguard against compromising doctrines, leaving the church, or at least shortening the amount of time that you're in dryness.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so, and I think there's a lot of other ways that it encourages the believer. And then of course, evangelistically, it gives warrant for the unbeliever. So, and I would say historically, only a minority of people who hear the gospel will accept it. And then only a minority of those people probably accept it for intellectual reasons. Say that that do respond to the gospel and apologetics has played a strong role in their testimony, those people tend to have pretty good influence on the society. Those tend to be the that it may be like engineers or people in medicine or lawyers or philosophy, and even the young people that are kind of heading that direction. Those people can be very influential in shaping the culture, and so I'd say that's a very important thing to remember. But it can certainly have its place in everyday evangelism. I mean, even a basic understanding of the arguments and evidence for theism and Christianity can greatly help in sharing the gospel in your own community. So, you don't have to be an expert, but it can definitely still play a solid role, especially when it comes to responding to questions that kind of can and do arise in the course of, let's say, a gospel presentation with somebody or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But another aspect I think that's important is the shaping of the culture, because the gospel's never heard in isolation. We always hear everyone that hears the gospel, they hear it against the background of the culture that they live in. So a person raised in a culture where Christianity is still seen as a viable option, they tend to display more of an openness to it, as opposed to a person who's been very secularized, maybe someone who's in academia or heavily influenced by secular pop culture, things like that. So, but I would say in general, the Western culture is deeply post-Christian. So it's it's still kind of a product of the Enlightenment, which kind of the hallmark of the Enlightenment was free thought, or the pursuit of knowledge by means of human reason alone. Mm-hmm. So the result of that was that theology was not really seen as a source of genuine knowledge. That goes back as recently as I would say the 50s or 60s. So then at that time, the physical sciences were taken as kind of the final authority to understanding the world around us. So I would say there's still that residual effect even on today's culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say the broader task of Christian apologetics would be to help create a culture and sustain a culture in which the gospel can be heard as an intellectually viable option for rational thinking people. Where maybe at 50, 60, 70 years ago, that really wasn't the case much.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that probably it's almost it's a defensive move. In the sense that you're taking offensive steps.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I would say it was around probably the 50s or 60s where, at least in the philosophy world, we, as kind of the Western culture, started to see more of a renaissance in Christian philosophy. So that allowed science to become more open to the existence of, at least of, the transcendent, and hopefully a creator and designer of the cosmos. And that just wasn't common until that happened.
Just so we can give some practical examples, how would we use this in evangelism, Royce?
I think that's a good question. It's kind of I would say a pretty broad question. So I think there would be some things to consider when you're kind of asking yourself how to use it. So you'd want to think about things like, in what setting are you evangelistically? Like, are you just out on the street? Are you somewhere academic, like, college campus or some, university? Or is it more casual, like at a party or an event, or are you in the workplace? Like, all those things kind of play a factor into, probably, I would say, evangelism in general. But then you also want to look at like kind of what's the demographic of people that you're speaking with. You know, are they college students? Are they maybe like kind of lay people, or would they be younger, like children, or older, or like you got to think about stuff like that. And what's your relationship to them? Are they strangers? Are they friends, relatives? And even things like what's the medium that you're using? I mean, today, yeah, there's spoken word and there's like public verbal discussions, but there's also social media, and there's so many means of presenting the gospel.
Well, I just call people on Facebook socialists, and then I assume that they're going to accept the gospel based on that.
Perfect. That's awesome. But
yeah. Let me
ahead.
give a specific one, and then maybe kind of go from there. Because like you said, it is a very broad question. Let's say someone is sharing the gospel with someone that they began to, or they have already had a relationship with, and they just believe different things. What would be a way of using this in a conversation like that?
Yeah, so you said like a friend or relative, someone you're close to.
Yeah, somebody you know relatively well.
Yeah, I think in those situations, generally those types of people, I mean, you're going to be spend more time with those people. So opportunities for apologetics, depending on the person's knowledge and understanding of certain things like science, mathematics, philosophy, like logical reasoning, stuff like that, it's still a pretty good opportunity because you generally will have a lot more time with that person, and you can talk through issues, you can talk through different deep, whether it be existential questions that people have, which is fairly common, or maybe they have an interest in philosophical matters, or maybe they are into different like scientific type of areas that they're interested in. Yeah, so those are great. And a lot of it just kind of, hopefully by the time you're close to them and they kind of know what you're about, the gospel has already been part of your relationship in some way.
Okay.
So that, you've shared the gospel with this person, you've tried to move them closer to Christ, but maybe for whatever reason they have objections, or they just don't feel convinced, or they want more explanation, or they want to feel like it's a reasonable, viable option for them. That's when apologetics can step in and help to guide that person. A lot of people have sincere, genuine objections to God that, if those objections get answered, I mean, that can definitely soften them to the gospel that they've probably already heard you speaking about, so yeah, right. Those are prime. I would say that would be a prime area where you could share with them. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's give another scenario. What about you encounter someone you've never met before? They believe something contrary to your belief, and you're sharing the gospel with them. You have a limited time for the conversation to unfold, 30 minutes, an hour, if that long. How does apologetics help in a conversation like that?
Yeah, when it's more in the setting where you're out on the street, let's say for the purpose of evangelism.
Yeah.
And you meet a stranger and you want to share your faith. In those situations, I would say it is probably the goal would be to try to keep the focus on the gospel as much as possible, and not allow yourself to go too deep into those rabbit holes that people might kind of drive you into by asking a lot of questions. And so I think that's just where kind of being prepared with responses that are succinct and that can get good quick response to things, but then you can try to steer those back to the gospel and to God, and more to issues of the heart, things like that.
Well, I think that's where kind of knowing where you're evangelizing at helps as well.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like where I live, I'm not going to search up and get really detailed on the Muslim faith, right? Because where I live, there's no Muslims, if any. There may be a few, but if any, there's none. I mean, I wouldn't think there's any at all. And so, but for me in small town Alabama, in the middle of the Bible Belt, kind of like we were talking about earlier, for myself, as I come out of high school, I would try to, understand how to best approach someone that is has an understanding of who Christ is, but hasn't truly believed in him, but they may think they have.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I think it's important to kind of know your audience to some point that you're able to. Now, obviously, you're in a larger city where there's a lot more diversity and things of the such. It would be more difficult to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think in the South, you're going to have a lot more people that'll say, or maybe older people too, that they'll acknowledge Jesus, but then they're not on the fence about him being the only way to God. Like those, you're probably going to have more of those kind of conversations.
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
I believe in Jesus, I'm just not into the whole church thing.
Mm.
So you're going to have to make arguments for why, you can't be loosey goosey about this. like Jesus was, you have to come across and say, well, Jesus was very definite about what he said. So either you're going to take the Bible in whole and believe everything Jesus said, or why are you pretending to believe it all? I mean, not you would literally say that, but that's
Yeah.
that's the kind of focus I think I have. Versus being, I mean, I live near Baton Rouge, near New Orleans, that kind of thing. So, I mean, and not just the South isn't all just Bible Belt people, but,
Yeah.
you'll have people who, I'll have people say, oh, well, the Bible is homophobic and sexist and that kind of thing. And they'll just reject it outright for those reasons. And then, it's like, well, if we're going to get into this conversation, first of all, they're trying to blow you off with making a truth claim. Well, one of the tactics is like, well, have them, if you're going to make a truth claim, you need to defend the truth claim, not me. And then, then you can go into conversations about, well, if it's homophobic and, sexist or whatever you're calling it, why does that even matter to you? What foundation are you judging that on? Like, you can get into conversations about that. Why do any of these things even matter to you? Is it just, arbitrary, or is there actual truth? Can we talk about that? Where does it come from? You can have some of those more philosophical, foundational, moral things, whereas the other people, the first category, they believe a lot of the same moral things you do. Right? Like the classic 1950s family, whatever. Like Leave It to Beaver type stuff. Like they might be moralistic, but or legalistic even, but they're not gospel. And that's the point.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask two more things, and then we'll kind of transition towards the end of the podcast. Really, when we go back to defining it and looking at the different methods and asking the question, is it biblical? Something that kind of stood out to me in the 1 Peter 3:15 is really the last little statement. It says, "Yet do it with gentleness and respect."
Yeah.
And so I'll ask you guys this: is other than the fact that Scripture tells us to, why is it important that gentleness and respect be something that we keep at the center of our apologetics?
It's kind of funny because I made a joke about Facebook earlier.
Yeah, I was gonna transition in and play off the joke, but somebody started talking about something different, so I wasn't able to.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. Is having a good defense for your beliefs and being able to articulate your beliefs well is one thing, but being able to hold a conversation with someone who has, opposing views, who might even be hostile, to your views, who might be coming from a place of just terrible experiences with Christians, and probably rightly so. I mean, we all know that we're not perfect. So they're watching what you're saying. They're watching your demeanor. They're watching your attitude towards them. They're watching, is this guy just like to hear himself talk, or does he care about me as a person, or is he just trying to win an argument? So I would definitely say there are rules that you'd want to keep being cordial. And, I think a big one is like letting people talk and actively listening to what they're saying. I mean, that is such an important thing. If you're interrupting, or you're not showing them that kind of like respect, like honestly, your arguments in a way just kind of go right out the window. And it's the same thing with like discounting a person's view by making assumptions about their character, or making assertions about why they believe what they believe, or what not really
Mhm.
focusing on the facts or the evidence and the arguments, but trying to make cuts at like, oh, you're just, you just hate God, or you're just selfish, or you just love your sin, or those things can be unhelpful too. They have their place, but you just got to be mindful about how you're approaching that type of stuff. And then another big one is showing humility, the way that, like, do you admit your ignorance on subjects? Like, someone tells this, bring something up that you don't know about, or asking for an answer that you don't feel to give. Like, are you open about that? And are you willing to say, no, I don't actually, that's a great question. I'll have to think about that more. Are you open to being educated? Do you admit that you have a lot to learn too? And, you can kind of like be on that same playing field with them, where it's like, we're both, I want to assume that we're both seekers of truth, and we both want to understand reality for what it is. And if they get that sense, I think it really adds a lot to the conversation, in my experience.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be another thing I was going to ask here in a minute, was what is the importance of admitting that you don't know the answer when trying to defend something, especially when it comes to you talking to someone that knows what they believe on a specific topic. If we act like we know the answer and we're bullcrapping it, then it's going to show, and it's going to shut down the
Jesus is the answer.
conversation.
Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the answer. That's all you need to know.
That's right.
Jesus is the answer.
All right.
If I say it long enough.
Well, I want to ask one more thing, and then Chris, I'm going to let you transition to the closing. Is this so? And I don't want to get any kind of argument on this, since we're talking about being respectful and all of that. So, where do you line up? Where do you guys line up with your different approaches of apologetics?
Go ahead, Chris.
I'll go ahead. Me and Royce actually had this conversation. Well, we've been talking through.
Did not end well.
We haven't spoken in months. Well, we've been talking through a lot of these things as I've been teaching through this class. But I guess on a theological level, I would align myself a lot with the presuppositionalist camp. But I think that I guess maybe call myself a light presuppositionalist, because you see some people show up and they're at a debate and they're like, well, you lost a debate for even showing up, because it's like, dude, what are you talking about? They just go so far overboard with it. And like the kind of presuppositionalist position, like as Roy said, was Romans 1, where people have a knowledge of God, but they're basically lying to themselves about it. And then again in First Peter, where it says, honor Christ the Lord as holy. And they would say, well, you don't step out of your Christian position. And if you do step out of your Christian position, because no one's neutral, then you're not honoring Christ as holy. Well, I think some people talk a big game about that, but then in practical terms, it's not necessarily very different than what most other people are doing. So I don't want to get out there. So I guess I would say where I'm presuppositionalist is that, some evidentialists or whatever would say, well, sure, if there was enough evidence, I would, to convince me that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I wouldn't believe it. I wouldn't go that far, right? So then that's probably a hardcore evidentialist. And maybe they're not being honest. Maybe they think they are, but they might not genuinely be. So, I guess to say I'm a presuppositionalist, but I'm not like crazy. So, but, like Roy said, a lot of presuppositionalists, you'll see them, and really most of the arguments they're making, they're preaching the gospel, and then they're having conversations with people. And those conversations involve evidence and philosophy and logic, depending on who you're talking to. So it's like some of these are almost false dichotomies. In the majority of the way people approach it, I don't think there's that much difference from what the everyday minister, how we're going to approach it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Royce, what you got?
Yeah, I think I align pretty closely with Chris. I hold tightly to Romans 1 in my view of people and how people trade, and my own tendency to suppress my knowledge of God for my own gain and my own fleshly desire. So I think I walk with that when I'm speaking to people. But when I approach people evangelistically, I do go more classical or evidentialist. But I think if you approach it correctly and well, then your apologetic can serve to help expose people's presupposition. And I think that's a really good use of it. You can manage people's objections, and you can provide good, solid arguments that are not easily refuted. Then you can help expose a person if they're still going to continue to deny the existence of God or deny the truths of Christianity. Then you can kind of start to see like, oh, this person doesn't have a strong basis for their rejection of God. And you can kind of see that suppression of the truth that presuppositionalists hold to.
Yeah. So I'm going to sound similar to you two guys. Then I'm going to sound like I'm in the kind of the middle in all of it, is that I would say I'm presuppositional in the sense of my soteriology, because I would say that those who are saved are those who that God has predestined. And when you read through John, specifically John chapter 10, Jesus is talking to a group of Jews, and he tells them that they do not believe because they are not his sheep. And so I would say that I'm in that view, in that understanding, because I would say that those that come to Christ are those that he's called to himself, and then calling to himself he's redeemed. But I would say that the other forms of it falls in line with that, because they are means in which God can bring individuals to himself. It may be evidential or classical or even experiential. Even that, I mean, though I don't think this should be our number one way of apologetics, but when we think of one sharing the gospel with an individual, I've known people that come to Christ and salvation after hearing the testimony of another. That would fall into that category. So I would say, though, presupposition.
It's late. It's all right, man.
Hey, is your Wi-Fi off?
Though I'm presuppositional, I would say that all of them are useful. Is really what I would boil down to. I do think there's some dangers in every one of them, and maybe we can get back on here and talk another hour about that. But as we come to a close, is there any last thing you want to give as an encouragement or just a exhortation to the listeners? Mine's this: regardless of what your approach of apologetics is, commit to it. If it be approaching those that are in the faith and they need encouragement to understand what they believe, or if it be those that you're evangelizing and sharing the gospel with, find them where they're at and take the gospel to them.
Yeah, and what I was thinking was that, like, like if you study apologetics, the worst thing that will happen is that your faith will be boosted. You will be able to help other Christians' faith to be strengthened, and that you will be able to better proclaim the gospel to people. Like, why wouldn't you want to study apologetics and the methods? It might give you a headache at first if you've never studied it before. It might make you frustrated. But that's with anything, learning an instrument, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to use a new computer operating system. Like, once you get into it, you'll realize how much better your life is with it. So yeah, that's my encouragement and exhortation to do it.
That's good. Yeah. I like, James, what you said about, knowing your, I don't know how you worded it, but it was something to the effect of knowing the people that you're going to be in contact with, or the people that you seek to evangelize, is really helpful in knowing how you want to approach apologetics. How deep into apologetics do you want to get into? How much time and energy do you want to pour into it? If you have a heart for the younger college age people, it's pretty good. I would say it's a pretty good idea to have a pretty good grasp of apologetics. And if you're just a person who, like, for me, like me, kind of switching gears over the last couple of years and giving more time to the urban poor or like homeless demographic, I'm using a lot less apologetics, because a lot of them are very open just through life experiences to the gospel. So I think it is a lot about knowing your field of influence and Yeah, it's very important.
Well, the reason why that's important, I mean, let's say somebody goes on a week or 2 week long mission trip to China or Russia or wherever the case may be. It would be smart to do some research before you go there to understand the people you're reaching out to. And the same thing in our everyday lives. So, any plugs of the week? So before we started, I jokingly or seriously told them I didn't have any plugs. But as we were talking through the conversation, I was reminded, and Chris was the one that reminded me of it, is, and I may be taking his plug here, is R.C. Sproul did a teaching series through Apologetics. And I've said this about R.C., and I'll say it again, is that one thing I love about him is that he's so intelligent, but he's able to present things in such a way that anybody can understand it, which is good for me because, I need that. And so I would encourage you to find that. I'm sure you could find bits and pieces of it on the podcast on that they have out, or you go to their website, or you can purchase the whole thing they have.
Yeah, I think it's just called Defending the Faith, or it's something like that. My I'll give two recommendations, and one because James brought it up, but one is our church. I'm actually teaching through a series on apologetics right now. So if you go to facebook.com/thisreformation, and maybe we'll share it on our page, or maybe a link to the YouTube playlist. We actually kind of go
putting all of them up, aren't you?
Yeah, they're all up. So all the classes are up. So we have some intro to apologetics. We have some topics that we're looking at specifically apologetically, and some things like that. So, and then I would also recommend Apologia Studios, or if you just Google search Jeff Durbin. It's a great, and partly because I'm recommending partly because I think I know what Royce is going to recommend or might recommend, and then what James did recommend. So I'm not recommending a book or anything like that. Go look up Jeff Durbin and just watch conversations he has with people on the street. There'll be, pastor destroys atheist argument, or Mormon walks away speechless, or pastor assaulted on the street. Like, it's all these kind of names because they want people to click them. But like, if you want to see practical examples of how to talk apologetically with people, and different kinds of people, and people who believe a different variety of things, because he goes to different areas of the country. Just go watch some of those. Some of them are 40 minutes long and he'll talk to 10 different people. Some of them are 30 minutes long. He'll talk to one person or whatever, or, 5 minutes long and it's just a short clip of talking to somebody. If you just want to see a good practical way of some people doing this, then go watch that. That's my recommendations.
Jeff Durbin, mic drop. Chris knows that my favorite apologist is William Lane Craig, and he's the founder of a ministry called Reasonable Faith, and they have a website, reasonablefaith.org. There's tons of good resources on there. He has podcasts. He has a lot of written work, both scholarly and at the popular level. So it's just a great resource. And then he wrote a book that's really good for introductory, I would say, apologetics, which is called On Guard. That gives you a really good high level of kind of the history of apologetics and its uses, probably a lot of stuff we spoke about tonight. And then also he does get into some of the logical argumentation and the evidence, and kind of just a really good entry level book. Yeah. And then the second book is called, it's just called Reasonable Faith. That's the name of his book. And that gets more in depth into the arguments, more advanced, breaks down a lot of the premises of the arguments, and dive deeper into the philosophy of it and the scientific proofs that he uses. So it's good.
Cool.
Awesome.
And he has a really good debate on YouTube I like watching debates, but him and Christopher Hitchens before he passed away. So
yeah, he's debated Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. He tried to debate Richard Dawkins, but Dawkins chickened out and ran away.
And it was even cool to see him, even like with someone like William Lane Craig, who lectures on apologetics all the time, has books, has the website, the ministry, all this kind of stuff. even whenever he was talking with Christopher Hitchens, him debating, the existence of God or, things like that.
Well, this has been another episode of the Everyday Ministry Podcast, and thank you for being a guest on here. I think we're going to have one more with you soon as well.
Yeah, hopefully I'd be happy to do it.
This has been another episode of the Everyday Ministry Podcast, and we're a podcast where everyday ministers get together to discuss ministry. God bless.
If you're encouraged by what you hear, please go like our Facebook page, share the episodes, and rate the podcast on iTunes. Don't forget that a new episode drops every first and third Mondays. Our prayer is that these episodes are an encouragement to you and that you would be faithful in the ministry that God has placed you in.
I'm sick of running into the wind that strikes my back. About time to start kicking and screaming. Gotta get out of here fast. I'm running. Where they know my name, heading back to my roots and all the roads that lead to you. Setting off on a one-way train to a place where they know my name. Yeah, my feet are pounding one by one on the gravel road that leads to freedom, freedom, freedom. It leads to you. My feet are